Hello guys, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto Reborn is the son of Orochimaru but fell in love with Leaf Girl? If you enjoy this video then please like, share and do comment. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation.
I wasn't sure what to expect when I felt like I could open my eyes once more. In fact, I didn't expect anything at all. I could see. It was an odd sensation, unfamiliar and completely foreign, and I wasn't entirely sure why. Sure, I could think of a few theories to my current predicament, but my mind was partially clouded. I rose up from the softness beneath me and looked around the relatively small room. A short bed, a box filled with junk near the door, and an end table. The walls were dark brown in color, but I imagined if the sun were shining through the window the room would light up beautifully. I strained my five senses and tried to determine the problem with the feeling I had. My sense of touch was heightened, as if the calluses on my skin from years of scrapes and bruises had been replaced by something more fragile. My sense of smell was phenomenal, the dirt on the ground, the wooden walls around me, the fragrant scent of flowers on the sheets underneath me. I could smell underlying scents of different people, like imprints in the air. It was dark, but I could see as if it wasn't, and that definitely shouldn't be possible, but I could not allow myself to hyperventilate right now. This sight is how I imagined a cat would see if I had suddenly switched species with my death. The theory was not completely ruled out. I could taste the air, and it tasted amazing. Refreshing, like the clearest water on a moonlit night. I blinked at the picture my mind conjured up and opened my mouth to breath in a huge gulp of air. I could feel something enter my body and join with me before twirling around my insides and escaping slowly from my pores. Magic? Mana perhaps? I could hear the sounds of breathing from another room in the house, as well as the sound of my own heart stuttering erratically. I calmed myself down with a few breaths and crossed my legs on the comfortable bed. I wasn't too sure what was going on. I was no longer in the same body I died in, obviously. I could feel that from the moment I woke up. But there was no explanation for it. I'm alive now. Alive again. I swallowed the spit in my mouth before trying to blank my mind and meditate. It was the best option right now, especially with the clawing feeling of hysteria building up in my throat. Oro-chan, come help me chop the vegetables. The woman I assumed was my mother said calmly, as if letting a 3-year-old handle sharp objects was an everyday occurrence. For all I knew it was. I nodded from my spot on the dirt floor and went into the kitchen to assist her. The name Oro struck me as strange, since the English equivalent was basically, huh. It humored me a little to imagine that my parents took one look at me when I was born and tilted their heads in confusion at my appearance. Oro? I would say, who was I to judge, but being the person named gave me every right. Though I cared little for what I was called. I took the stool from the pantry and went to the sink to wash my hands before handling the vegetables. The knife I was handed was recently sharpened and well made for a dirt floor home. I assumed the house was a matter of preference. There was plumbing, and the home itself seemed to have grown from the ground, seeing as the walls looked like actual tree trunks. Bumps and knots, but smooth as if it had been sanded and polished. I've yet to step outside, but I imagined that we lived in a carved-out tree. A tree bigger than any that have existed in my old world. With magic at my fingertips, I fully believed I had transmigrated to another universe. Another Earth where humans evolved differently due to the nature of the Earth itself. Magic was everywhere around us, and I found I could sense the locations of those who held it within themselves as well. I stared down at the knife, then proceeded to cut the vegetables with a surprising amount of dexterity. The ease at which my body followed commands astounded me, considering I'd never before been capable of cutting vegetables this quick in my previous life. The tap of the knife's edge hitting the wooden counter beneath the vegetables soothed me. The mundane action satisfied me immensely as the task was finished in record time. Thank you, my dear. Mother smiled before going back to her work. The pleasure that filled me at the simple acknowledgement shocked me still for a second before I nodded and went back to occupying myself in the living room area. I drew meaningless squiggles as I tried to calm myself once more. My brain seemed to be exceptionally faster than I was comfortable with, and I found if I didn't keep myself busy with something stimulating I would go insane. I sat still for 10 minutes before I decided I needed to explore the home to familiarize myself with my surroundings. Furniture was scarce, but what we did have was quite soft and aesthetically pleasing to the eyes. The bookshelf looked to be carved by hand with intricate designs, while the couch looked to be made of a soft coat of cured fur. Warm, soft, inviting. The place itself was relatively small, so there really wasn't much to explore, besides the bathroom and my parents' room. I estimated the home itself had the diameter of 25 feet. Quite small for 3 people, but I imagined that the citizens of this world lived quite simply despite their technology. I looked through the books and found myself giddy at the readable characters. I can read and speak a different language naturally without any actual memory of learning to do so. I decided learning about this world can start from here. The rhythm of my new life came easily to me and filled me with a sense of comfort and security. Mother was methodical with her schedules and kind with her words, and it matched my personality magnificently. Father worked as a chunin in the village we resided in and sometimes left for weeks at a time, but when he was here he lit up the house with his exuberance. His personality seemed to bring balance to the household and smoothed out some of Mother's rougher edges, but I imagined Mother's personality helped the man smooth out his erratic behavior as well. I could see the traces of insanity the man sometimes displayed, most probably due to trauma from the job he worked at. Shinobi. The substance that ran throughout my body was called chakra here, and shinobi used it to fight shinobi from other villages. A world of endless war seemed to have been built around the use of this magnificent chakra, and I found myself hesitant to stay a part of it. Humans seemed to require violence no matter the dimension it seemed. As time moved slowly, I had read through the entire bookshelf, learned how to cook every meal Mother knew, and trained with Father. I did not object. I was in no position to change anything in the world, and frankly I had no chance to survive if I did not conform to it. I was not sour about what this life entailed, not at all. In fact, I found myself constantly intrigued as Father continued to teach me more and more about chakra, battle, and this world's society. This world had so much to offer, and I knew I would never live long enough to learn it all. Father could only teach the leaf-styled taijutsu, which was a heavily watered-down version of the senju style. He taught me the basics of ninjutsu, which included the transformation jutsu, the replacement jutsu, and the clone jutsu. He instructed me on throwing shurikens, kunai, and senbon, and then moved on to tactics using a game called shogi. In little under a year I had mastered everything he could give me and thirsted for more. It was exhilarating being able to push my body to the brink of exhaustion and then use chakra to make my muscles do more. I could jump to unbelievable heights and move with an ease I had never imagined was possible. Rarely was there a moment where I did not have a pleased smile on my face. My parents were not perfect by far, with their occasional lover spats and not so quiet lovemaking, but they encouraged me to do whatever I wanted and acknowledged everything with parental pride and love. I could go out to the village as long as I returned before nightfall, and if I asked to camp out at a friend's they did not question it and smiled. Of course I didn't have any friends, but it gave me the excuse to explore the village at night and train for longer periods of time. Books became my lifeline when Father could no longer teach me. Anything more than D-rank jutsu at this time could damage my still developing chakra coils, so I simply had to wait until I was old enough for the academy. I still managed to learn jutsu from scrolls at the village library, but all of them were D-rank since anything more was forbidden for those less than genin level in the village. There was a slew of camping jutsu that made living in the wilds a breeze, and my personal favorite, the flicker jutsu. For some odd reason I had to carry a pile of leaves in my pocket to drop in my place whenever I did the jutsu. Had to do with village solidarity, I assumed. The other village had their own things for the flicker jutsu as well. The logs, I had no clue about. If I did not replace myself with anything, then a log with my same weight would automatically appear and replace me on its own. I have simply decided to ignore the mysterious log. Everyone else seems content to believe it normal after all. One evening, as I was training my jutsu to work without the need for hand seals, I felt the approach of a child frantic with impatience. I jumped backwards into a tree to hide and watched as the strangest-looking child burst out from the forest bushes with a loud gasping cry and fell to the ground on his hands and knees pathetically. I felt revulsion at the ugly expression on his face and decided to leave when I tasted the scent of his body on my sensitive tongue. I paused and continued to stare with narrowed eyes as the child slowly picked himself up and limped forward into the shade of the trees nearby. The moon was unnecessarily bright in this world, so the boy was hardly hidden at all. Especially with that large obnoxiously white mane of hair. I blinked when the boy took out a kunai with shaking hands before pulling at the hair I had internally criticized. I flickered to the boy's side in an instant and grabbed his fist before he could chop his hair off. It frustrated me that he would do such a thing when he'd obviously never cut it once in his life. I was the same, and I was quite fond of my silky black strands. Oro? The boy looked up at me in shock and I found myself slightly disgusted at the snot running down his chin. I was also pissed that he'd called me so familiarly when I had never seen him before. What? Who are you? Right, my name was a common interjection in this language. Silly me. I forcibly pushed down my ire and tried to look at the child with the same look my mother gives me when I do something wrong. The child flinched and brought his fisted hands to his lap, clutching the kunai stubbornly. I contemplated just leaving the child to figure himself out before I smoothed my face out at the smell wafting from the disgusting child. I was raised to be a polite man in both lives and I wasn't going to let the child know how utterly disgusted of him I was. Children, I am sorry, the boy whispered, as if talking any louder would be a sin in this gentle night. I slowly breathed before sitting on my calves with my toes the only thing touching the ground. You did nothing wrong to me, child, I said softly, attempting to replicate the tone my mother had used after a lengthy tongue lashing. The child, who was now at eye level with me, looked into my eyes and startled. His black orbs dilating with surprise. He did not move, as if my eyes alone had frozen him to the ground. He stuttered out a shaky breath before looking at my clothes. I may as well stay and finish what I started on a stupid impulse. I nearly sighed with how tedious this interaction was going to be. Boy, what is your name? I asked first, to get the ball rolling a little faster so I could leave and continue my training. The child gaped before irritation shadowed his snot-covered face. Good, if he finds me insufferable then I can use this to leave and continue my training. Why, you're just a kid too, Teme. The child accused as he glared at me. He did not move back to open up the space between us, which I found slightly curious despite my growing irritation at the child's behavior. He was clearly suffering from loneliness if I'm reading him correctly. I acted on my intuition and gave the child my kindest smile before lifting my hand and running it through his hair, as if soothing a pitiful dog. Pitiful indeed. The child's breath hitched at the contact as he tried to hold back his tears, his brief moment of trying to make himself angry and embarrassment leaving as he succumbed to his sadness. I brought the child into my arms and let him cry into my chest as I smoothed out his hair. I ignored the stench of blood, piss, and vomit surrounding me with careful, slow breaths. I kept my heart calm in an attempt to calm the child since he had his ear to my chest. Tell me what happened, child. I urged carefully as I pulled the child in a little tighter to give him a sense of safety. This was something I did not learn from my current mother. My previous set of parents had been the touchy type and had basically smothered me with overwhelming love. I preferred the current set that had the same social qualms as I did about physical affection. Unfortunately, most children required the touch of another for emotional security. I thought hard on how I could escape this without destroying the child's self-esteem and future development before succumbing to the fact that this will take a while and I had no one to blame but myself. The child's white hair may have been obnoxious, but I could not deny that it was beautiful, and I found it would be quite the shame if he had chopped it off so haphazardly. I brought the silent child home and bathed him carefully with a clean soft cloth. He needed a delicate hand with what I assumed he went through, and I made sure to let him know with silent gestures exactly what I was doing. He was like an obedient doll that lifted his arms when I needed to wash his sides, and lifted his legs when I needed to get at his feet. It was a simple enough procedure, and I had been made to babysit children on occasion for my siblings in my previous life. I knew how to handle children, simple as that. Didn't mean I liked them. I no longer had the worry that I gained my siblings' displeasure if I mistreated a child in any way, but the fact that they were no longer here meant little. Kindness had been trained into my soul from a young age, so it was now an unfortunate trait I was stuck with. Just the thought of my older sister's face looking down at me with disappointment made me reconsider any undesirable act towards any pitiful creature. Did not stop me from thinking horrible thoughts about them, however. I dried off the listless creature and clothed him in my spare sets and brought him to my room to rest. I let him cuddle into my arms and did my absolute best to keep my calm once more. I loathed this breach of personal space but forcibly stopped myself from thinking about it and hyperventilating. I managed to fall asleep an hour later after keeping my mind carefully blank. When morning came, I slowly untangled myself from the cuddling menace and sat at the edge of the bed to brush out my hair. I did not enjoy the tangles I'd accumulated from sleeping with wet hair, but it had to be done. 10 minutes later, my nest of a head had been thoroughly tamed, and so I proceeded to do my morning exercise regime on the ceiling. There was just enough room for me to do a full workout. By then an hour had passed and I was soaked with sweat from pushing myself to the limits again. My father had been an excellent regime builder and I followed it every day. Of course, he had wanted me to do it at least 2 times a week, but I was certain that wasn't gonna be of much use when everyone was so freakishly abnormal. I landed on the floor silently, my clothing and hair magically readjusting themselves around me as I looked at the now open-mouthed child sitting up in my bed. He looked marginally better now that his face wasn't scrunched up and snotty from crying his soul out. His tanned skin looked bright and healthy, and his black eyes lit up with clear reverence at the sight of me. I could definitely learn to love being looked at like that. I had never had someone look up to me before as someone amazing. I had been a mediocre waste of space before I came here after all. "Good morning, child." I smiled warmly. Of course, with my young voice it sounded quite condescending, but I was still quite unused to being a child myself. Predictably, the child frowned at how I addressed him before scowling, then crossing his arms and pouting. "Not child. Forgive me, what is your name?" I soothed as I gave him a short bow of my head in apology. I needed to remember to treat the little twit as an equal. As frustrating as that sounds. A bright smile broke out on the boy's face and I found myself staring as he transformed from a depressed little rat into a literal ball of sunshine. I found myself softening a little towards him despite my reservations. "I'm the amazing, super awesome, handsome and smart, Jiraiya-sama." The now-named Jiraiya proclaimed as he proceeded to mess up my bed further by jumping around and landing on the floor with his hand out in front of him. His breath was rough as he made a silly pose along with his silly smile. He reminded me of my father. I snorted at his exuberance before patting his head and looking into his eyes with a smile I remember mother using whenever father started acting up. Jiraiya had the predicted expression of blushing and looking away with a small pout. He was quite pretty for a boy. I blinked at the observation before filing that thought away and ruffling Jiraiya's mess of a mane. "You can call me Orochimaru. If I could skip the academy and go on to being a shinobi, I would do it in a heartbeat. Normally my patience is quite strong. I'd been training it for a lifetime after all, but I could not suffer another minute of the sensei's enthusiastic approach to teaching things I'd long since learned. Reading, writing, math, geography, and history. Turns out, most children don't know how to read and write at the age of 5. Most children were also orphans due to the ongoing war, and the depression of the children, along with the enthusiasm of the idiotic teacher, made for an extremely tense classroom experience. It's barely been a month. Oddly enough, Jiraiya's been avoiding me since the first day of class when everyone had to introduce each other. For the life of me I could not understand why, but I had no interest in discovering the inner workings of a 5-year-old's mind. The sharp pain of rejection had only lasted a moment before I'd ruthlessly crushed it and kept myself calm and collected. I finished all the work, answered all the questions, and disciplined myself by staring unblinkingly at the teacher as he lectured the class on things I knew. Patience was my strongest trait, and I would not allow this tedious academy to break it. The monotony was finally broken a month later when the teacher introduced the physical training portion of shinobi training. The children had cheered, while I allowed for a smile of gratefulness to appear on my face. It left as quickly as it came when I noticed Jiraiya gaping at me from across the room. I frowned and turned away from him to follow the teacher out into the schoolyard. I scolded myself for even looking in the direction I knew he'd be in my brief moment of happiness. Moronic. I followed along with the short 20-minute workout the teacher demonstrated blandly without breaking a sweat, then followed along with the demonstration of the leaf-style katas. There weren't very many compared to the clan styles in the village, but I imagined it was a general type of taijutsu for beginners. I'd need to eventually develop my own style using the leaf as a basis. I contemplated copying animals like they did in my previous world with martial arts. I followed along with the others easily and let my mind wander to more important things, such as which animal I'd want to copy. If anything, I'd like to choose a reptile, for no other reason than my plain admiration of them. Most reptiles were scary beautiful, like the lizard, the salamander, skinks, chameleon, crocodiles, snakes. I vaguely remember there had been a style in my previous world dedicated to snakes. Perhaps I could replicate it. I'd need to find some snakes to study and learn from first before I could begin, however, and I imagine it would require far more flexibility than I currently possessed. The taijutsu practice ended after an hour and I found myself unsatisfied by the pitiful warm-up. I looked at the other students and felt disgust fill me. All of them were sweaty and panting like filthy dogs. The ugly scent of sweaty children filled my nose and mouth and nearly made me squirm in abhorrence. It did not look like any of them took their training seriously enough. Even Jiraiya looked less worn out than the others and he was a complete idiot. I felt my mood plummet further when most of the students looked towards me in awe. I breathed carefully and looked towards the teacher for more instruction. He called for a break. At lunch I found myself bombarded by the children and incessant chattering. My heart grew cold as I blocked out the feeling of utter revulsion towards them as I politely smiled and answered whatever questions I heard. I didn't get to eat my meal. The afternoon was dedicated to obstacle courses combined with dodge training. It was a once-a-week type training since it required genin to be paid to come and throw water balloons at the children. I thought it was unfortunate. It was the most rewarding training I'd had so far. I almost broke a sweat. When the next week came and went, I made a startling discovery. I was being stalked. A smaller controlled body of chakra, mimicking the size of a mouse, would constantly be nearby. Every day at noon the chakra would be switched out for another but continued to stay nearby at all times. Outside my room, at the training grounds I went to every afternoon, at the school, and while I was out doing errands for mother. I did not know what to make of it. For what reason would anyone keep tabs on me 24/7? Of course, it had to be my exceptional performance in class. I heard the whispers of the people around me wherever I went and I knew I was becoming known to all in Konoha as a genius. It's almost as if no one's heard of hard work and dedication. Imbeciles. I decided to spend most of my time inside my house, and switched up my training time to reading time instead to make up for my lack of stimulation. I trained harder in my room with the windows covered, and went to the library every 3 days to check out a new book. I made sure to steal books too, since there was a limit on how many books an academy student can take out. The ones I stole were of higher levels, while the ones I signed out were fiction for when I felt I needed to relax. I was stalked for 3 whole months. The stress was building up from my lack of freedom, and the frustration was getting harder and harder to force back. I felt as if I was constantly on the tipping point to a mental breakdown, but my self-discipline was far stronger than this. It did not help when the second most popular child in class confronted me during lunch. Jiraiya was a riot to be around according to the other students. He was clever with his words but idiotically happy and social. He thrived on the affection of his classmates and usually avoided me like the plague. Unfortunately, his book smarts had much to be desired, and when the rankings were posted on the bulletin board he appeared to be consumed with childish jealousy. The worst kind. Orochi teme. Jiraiya bellowed dramatically as he jumped from somewhere in the trees and landed in front of me. At some point, the child had cut his hair. When I'd first seen it, it was as if I had been slapped. I knew nothing about the boy other than the fact that he suffered a terrible trauma, and it had hurt that he didn't come to me about it. He'd cut his beautiful mane down to almost nothing. I found my eyes softening as I looked upon the boy. "Did you need something, Jiraiya-kun?" I asked in a friendly tone. I did feel annoyance at his silly entrance, but I found his actions were becoming more fond to me as the time went by. Jiraiya looked hideously angry, and I dropped the smile as he stomped towards me and poked me chest harshly. I looked at him with confusion as he took a deep breath to yell. "You think you're so much better than everyone, don't you?" My eyes widened in surprise. "Absolutely not. How did he find out? Just because you got first place doesn't mean you can act all high and mighty, you coward." His finger jabbed me in the chest once more and it made me wince in pain. He was using chakra to try and hurt me, and I could feel the bruise forming beneath my hori. I blinked at his accusations as my mind stuttered to a slow, deadly stop. "Excuse me, coward?" I could barely think as the boy I had grown to think fondly towards yelled in my face and clutched the fabric near my neck. He brought his face closer to mine with barely an inch between our noses. The lemon candy scent that came from his breath nearly made a bubble of hysterical laughter spill from me, but I managed to hold it back by a thread. "You think it's so funny, don't you?" His voice childishly cruel. Acting like a princess with your fancy clothes and stupid voice. Don't think anyone actually likes you. My heart stuttered as I breathed in a shaky, slow breath. I squeezed my eyes shut as I felt the dam break on my meticulous control. Jiraiya's grip on my Haori loosened as he backed away, but I couldn't focus enough to care. A minute passed as I tried desperately to hold myself together. I dare not open my eyes for the emotion the children will see in them. My revulsion and disgust towards them. My hate and disappointment in them, and the despair of my now shattered control. Very slowly I took another gasping breath and clutched the fabric on my chest to hold the spot I knew was bruising from Jiraiya's finger. I could not hold back the clawing sensation of emotion coming out from my stomach and into my throat. My breath grew ragged as I slowly lifted my head to look into Jiraiya's eyes. Whatever the child saw I'd never know since I was gone in the next moment. I did not bother with the idiotic pile of leaves. No one spoke to me after that day. Of course it did not help that I no longer bothered to smile or act kind towards anyone. I truly could not bring myself to. I could no longer pretend. I should have known better than to even try pretending. It was the reason I died in the first place after all. I worked quietly and drowned out the chatter by keeping my mind busy. I brought books to class to keep my attention elsewhere and used my time wisely. Stalkers be damned, I could literally care less. I'd had to stay completely apathetic to keep the childish emotions at bay. That's what they are after all. The emotions of a child. Being reborn with my memories intact did not stop me from the unstable hormones of a growing child, and bottling them had done little to no good for my mental state. Frankly enough, I could not let myself be humiliated by indulging in the whims of being a child. Wanting a friend in Jiraiya, hoping he'd speak to me, feeling hurt that he ignored me, and missing the warmth he had given me that night when he slept over. I was fooling myself in thinking it was disgust in children when it was actually disgust in myself for loving the sensation of Jiraiya in my arms. No, it was not something so mentally revolting like pedophilia, but rather a deep sense of loneliness that had never gone away no matter what I tried. There has yet to be a person that truly wanted to be around me for who I was, and I had known that my whole life. My old parents had thought I was creepy and over time had completely stopped trying to interact with me. I had loved them, but I hadn't appreciated the affectionate hugs and mushy conversations, and my parents had been mushy people in nature. My siblings included. I had eventually learned to copy how they acted as I grew up, but it had taken so long. Far too long, and by the time I'd figured it out, so much damage had already been done. I was bullied all the way up until I graduated high school. I was just in time for college, just in time to experience normal life, but I hated it with every fiber of my being. Getting drunk, chatting about useless things, getting laid at parties and having a girlfriend. I was surrounded by friends, but none of them knew me for who I was. It was at one party, after a raunchy night, that I died. It had been horrifying. The girlfriend I'd never loved had caught me and humiliated me in front of everyone, calling me names and ousting me on my abnormal behavior outside of society. I was not a kind, loving, pleasant friend. I was never understanding of other people's problems, nor did I care for any of the conversations I'd had with anyone I ever met. She had seen me in my home where I forgot to keep up the act and never commented on it until that night. I suppose I broke her heart first and deserved it, but I had never understood why that would consequent public humiliation. I never understood anyone, though I could certainly pretend I did. I ran out of the party drunk out of mind as those freaks of nature threw their empty glass bottles at my person. Glass cuts and pieces littered anywhere skin was showing, which had been a lot since I'd only been wearing my trunks. I ran into the street and down to the lake where I knew I'd find my peace and quiet before jumping off the docks and diving to the seaweed. I have 2 bells here, Sarutobi-sensei grinned. You 3 will have to get the bells in order to pass my test. The dark-skinned man stood with the bells up in one hand and his other hand on his hip. I found it to be quite the feminine pose, but seemed natural on him for a man with larger than average arms. But I just finished a test, sensei. Jiraiya complained loudly from my left. I did not turn to look at him. Instead I stared at the bells and began analyzing. My brain was grateful for the distraction as my eyes moved around the field and took in my surroundings. Baka-sensei, there's only 2 bells. Tsunade pointed out. I glanced at her from the corner of my mind and felt a sense of loss that she did not have better than average intelligence. It did not seem like I will be getting along with these 2. How much time do we have? I asked as I looked into Sarutobi-sensei's eyes. The man looked relatively pleased at my question and a burst of pleasure filled me. He seemed to approve of me. That was one good thing out of this predicament. He looked up at the sky before pulling out a timer from seemingly out of nowhere and placed it on the training stump beside him. An hour, he pressed the button on the timer and the countdown began. Begin, Kuso. Jiraiya jumped back into the bushes, following Tsunade. I went after them and watched with a growing sense of unease as Jiraiya pawed at Tsunade. Get off me, bastard. Tsunade hissed before bringing her fist on his head and knocking him out flat. I stared at the boy with a dull expression before meeting Tsunade's eyes. Want to work together? I asked carefully, masking the hope I felt behind a show of indifference. I can take the old man myself. The girl glared before running out to the clearing. Ah, better luck next year, I said sourly as I looked at the dumb-looking boy at my feet. I sighed before kneeling down and nudging his shoulder. The boy groaned before rolling over and looking up at me. I looked at him tiredly and decided it was worth a shot. Wanna work together, Oro? Yes? I tilted my head and narrowed my eyes at him. Well, EHH. Why would you want to work with me? Jiraiya looked absolutely baffled by my question. Then he looked at me with suspicion and proceeded to back away until his back hit a tree. I'll have you know I'm straighter than a ruler. I like women. Big-breasted blondes with beautiful baby-making curves. He declared proudly. Good for you, I said dryly. A moment passed as Jiraiya proceeded to stare at me with squinted eyes and a deep frown. It made him look hilariously ugly, but I didn't bother with laughing at him. I wasn't in the mood for it. Did you want to work with me or what? No, Jiraiya screeched before booking it past me into the clearing to have his shot at Sensei. I blinked at the suddenness of it and wondered why the hell his face was so red. I shook my head and followed after the two idiots so I can help them as much as possible. Needless to say, Jiraiya was tied to the stump with his stomach growling in protest. I looked down at the homemade food Sensei had made and felt mildly disgusted at its contents. Plain rice and dried dates. I glanced at Tsunade and noticed she was eating her meal as if it were nothing. I looked up at the starving 6-year-old struggling in the ropes and stood. Jiraiya stopped his struggling and looked at me with childish curiosity, while Tsunade watched and continued eating her food. I'm going to feed you my serving, Jiraiya, I said using the same sternness my mother uses when telling me it's time to take a break from my books. His face reddened down to his neck as I brought the food to his mouth with my unused chopsticks. He obediently ate the food and didn't complain once, while Tsunade kept looking at the both of us with raised eyebrows and a sly smile. I rolled my eyes at her antics just as Sensei returned in a poof of chakra smoke with a glimmer in his eyes. Why did you feed Jiraiya? Sarutobi-sensei asked me expectantly. I blinked in contemplating lying and saying something sappy like teamwork and swiftly decided against it. I was certain lying was not going to be possible with this man. I don't like dates, I stated truthfully. Exactly. Teamwork is the excuse me what? Sensei stuttered. I quickly retracted my truth and attempted to lie. He was gonna die if he didn't eat anything, so I forcefully fed him to keep him alive so we'd be a better force against you this afternoon. What? Tsunade looked at me with a baffled expression. I crumbled under the combined stare of all three of them and sighed. I really don't like dates. He fed me 'cause of teamwork Sensei, he's a pathological liar. Jiraiya explained happily, not caring that he was also dragging my name through the mud. Yeah, just ignore Orochimaru-kun. Teamwork is really important to the three of us. Tsunade chimed. Is that so? Sensei said as his eyebrow twitched with irritation. No, I truly abhor dates with plain rice. It's unappetizing and an insult to my palate, I said with all the honesty I could muster. Watch it, Orochi-kun, that's my wife's cooking you're talking about. She's a terrible cook, idiot. Tsunade barked out before I felt a sudden pain at the side of my head and promptly blacked out. Surprisingly, we passed despite the fact that I'd tried lying to Sarutobi-sensei. Once I'd woken up, I'd untied Jiraiya from the stump and was informed of the meeting at 7 a.m. the next day. I don't think I'd ever be able to lie to the man again even if I tried. His dead monkey eyes really creeped me out. I managed to get a full-length mirror in my room today. I set it up near the dresser and studied my strange looks thoroughly. I'd never actually looked at myself before like this. Seeing my reflection in the water hadn't really been the same. I knew I had grayish skin, like an alien. At first I thought it was because I was a fairy or something in a magical kingdom. My mother had the same skin tone, and my father was incredibly pale as well, though he did look a little more natural. My hair was long, and black, and softer than any fabric I'd ever felt before. I had something like a purple tattoo around my eyes that were perfectly symmetrical. In fact, my face was entirely symmetrical and feminine. I was quite the beauty, and it made more sense now why Jiraiya had called me a princess before. My eyes were a beautiful shining amber that I found absolutely fascinating. Snake eyes. I wondered if that was why I was named Big Snake. I poked at the purple markings on the sides of my nose and marveled at the texture. It was almost rough, but smoother than my own skin. I liked my appearance. It was different, vastly different from anyone else's, but I was so used to being different that it no longer mattered. I loved it. Beautiful. I admired myself a little longer, then went to dig through my clothes to find something to wear for the training this morning. My traditional clothes were not made for drawn-out fighting, though they were breathable and comfortable. I needed something that made my body feel faster and secure. My dresser was filled to the brim with traditional outfits. Hakama, kimono, yukata, training hakama, my haori. I really liked my haori. It was an off-white color with dark blue rims and black tomo, and felt secure when I tied it around my waist with the dark blue thick obi belt. Instead of the hakama underneath, perhaps I could try the shinobi pants, though the dark blue would harshly clash. I needed new clothes. I looked out the window before putting on my usual outfit, grabbing my wallet and heading to the shinobi outfitting shop. Once I went through the door of the shop and heard the ring of the bell above, I looked towards the shopkeeper and nodded politely before going to the child shinobi section. I skimmed through the various styled outfits and picked out a few fishnet underclothes. They'd be a lot more breathable than the kimono I usually wore underneath my haori, though it would be far from traditional. It wasn't like I could keep to father's sense of traditional style while being a shinobi anyway. Though the haori was definitely staying. Mother had gifted me this one on my 5th birthday, and it still fit me well, though it was a few sizes too big. It would follow me until teenagehood, that's for sure. I found the shinobi pants and looked through the colors before picking a few in dark gray. Then I grabbed some black shinobi boots that came up to the middle of my calves and had the toes bare for breathing. I loved the styled shoes in this world, they were so clever. My feet never became stinky with the types of shoes available here. Strong scents were basically forbidden since most shinobi had stronger senses from years of training. I was ready to go to the till when I noticed something that caught my eye. I slowed and stopped in front of the glass box and stared at the pair of dark purple earrings with curiosity. I was an Uzumaki-style earring if the swirl was any indication, and looked like the shells commonly found in uzushio. I was not an Uzumaki, but these were quite beautiful and I knew they'd match me perfectly. I opened the glass case and took the pair of earrings with me to the till. Once everything was paid for, I went home and changed into my new clothes and smiled at my appearance. I made for a cute mini ninja, but I felt far more agile than before. I went out to meet the team for the first training session and held a mild hope that the brats wouldn't be too much of a nuisance. I really should have known better. What more could I expect from selfish children who cared little for anyone but their own needs and wants? They knew nothing of compassion, patience, and empathy. Traits like that needed to be learned over a long period of time and never truly set in until the child reaches adulthood. At least that's what I've noticed from my observations of children in my past life. There had been the exceptional few that learned these lessons earlier due to trauma and harshly learned lessons. I met the team and participated in their childish introduction games with a feeling of heavy boredom dragging me down. I wasn't interested in their likes and dislikes, and they were not interested in mine. I paid attention to Sarutobi-sensei though, since he seemed to have a soft spot for me. For the next coming months we focused on team drills, chakra control, and strengthened our basics before doing 1D rank mission a day. Sarutobi-sensei made sure to keep all of us thoroughly stimulated and eager to learn by giving each of us one-on-one training using shadow clones. Each of us learned at our own paces and improved considerably. During this time I found that Jiraiya seemed to be deeply disturbed by me, while Tsunade was quite indifferent towards me. I knew what I could do to get closer to the both of them, but for the life of me I could not force myself to do it. I stayed true to myself and openly showed my emotions, though they were dulled after years of suppressing them successfully. I almost felt like a robot with my inability to care. I used to wonder why I had been so different from others in my past life. My parents were too ashamed to bring me to a psychiatrist to determine my mental state since they had a healthy reputation in the community. They did not want people thinking their family was less than perfect, and I completely understood that. I never used to, but after dying of humiliation I fully understood what they had been worried for. I was an anomaly in their perfect little family, and if anyone came to know about it, it would spread through the town and my family would be the town's favorite source of dramatic gossip. The bullying I had dealt with as a child had already caused enough humiliation for my family, which is why I had tried so desperately to be normal. I did love them after all, and I cared for their approval. I missed the times as a young child when I'd learn something quickly and my dad would run up to me and proudly tell me how happy he was for me. Then he'd hug me and it would be ruined, but I still loved the praise. Fortunately, I found my current family much more to my liking. They were absolutely amazing people. Somehow they seemed to automatically know that I hated being touched. They also knew that I hated silly small talk and conversations about mushy love and gossip. Instead, they filled our interactions with conversations to do with philosophy, knowledge they'd picked up in their lives, and stories of the various lessons they'd each learned in their lifetimes. They did not hold back on details, and I always found myself looking up at them with adoration in my eyes. They taught me a lot of things about emotion and reading other people's expressions, and taught me a better way to pretend like they understood. They also told me it was okay to be me, that it didn't matter what those frivolous civilians thought of me because I was going to be so strong that they'd be forced to accept me for who I was. They also said something about someday finding someone who will love me for who I was, but I did not hold much hope for that. I liked the thought of being the strongest in this world. I liked the thought that it was actually possible as long as I worked harder than anyone else and learned more than anyone else did. Well, I was well on my way, wasn't I? Unfortunately, I could not make up my mind on what I should specialize in. There was far too much to learn in this world, and I knew for a fact that I would never be able to learn it all. I could choose 2 or 3 things, and that would be my limit since a shinobi's life expectancy topped off at 60 at the oldest. Our Hokage Tobarama Senju, he'd specialized in fuinjutsu and water-style ninjutsu, and branched off by creating his own jutsus he'd shared with the Leaf. In 60 years he could hardly call himself a master of fuinjutsu, but he'd gone far enough to make the Hiraishin, as well as various other seals that the village now uses for everyday use. What hope did I have to master any subject of shinobi lifestyle when our best could not master his own specialties? So far I'd been turning into a jack of all trades because I could not make up my mind. Sure, I was exceptional at everything I did, but I was at a clear chunin level when I could be jonin if I'd specialized already. I was interested in everything: ninjutsu, taijutsu, fuinjutsu, genjutsu, poisons, medic jutsus, weapons, forbidden jutsus, and not to mention the various undiscovered breakthroughs of science and biology. I could recreate technology at its finest and bring this village to greatness, but I did not have the time to do it all. I did not have this problem in my previous life. I had only been motivated to be normal back then while also being physically and mentally lazy. Before, I did not see the point in finding a niche in society without being able to act like everyone else. And now? I had all the options in the world, and 75% of those options dealt with magic. Oh, it was exhilarating and despairing in equal measure. I did not know what to do. For now I listened to the instructions of Sarutobi-sensei and built up the basics to their maximum level since I knew it would be important for whatever I chose to do. Jiraiya and Tsunade had already picked their specialties. I stood still, my mind dark and empty, as I stared at the stones in the graveyard. I could feel the rain soaking me to my bones, but I did not shiver. I knew I was cold, but I did not care. The stones held the names of mother and father, reminding me that I'd never see their faces again. Oh gods, my heart ached with a deep penetrating hollowness that could not be swallowed down. My eyes leaked salty tears, but the rain hid them well and my skin did not pigment with emotion. I didn't turn when I felt Sensei's chakra behind me. How had they even died? Mother was not a shinobi, and father was on leave. I had returned home after a week-long C-rank mission to find their bodies strewn across the living room and kitchen as if they'd killed each other. But that did not make sense. They had loved each other. Their arguments may have gotten out of hand at some points, but they had never gone so far as to physically hurt one another. Though there was no evidence of it being a staged domestic violence case, I knew better. I only wish I knew who would do something like this to them. They had never done anything in their lives to warrant death. They'd been loyal to Konoha, and surprisingly enough my mother had had friends with members in the Uchiha clan as well. My father was too much of an idiot to make enemies, and no one could hate a man that was so inherently kind. Hours seemed to pass as I let my tears silently fall. The skies had slowly cleared over time, letting the bright sun shine obnoxiously upon my pale skin as if to tell me things would be alright. A surge of burning, consuming anger filled me and left in me the next second. Useless. Being angry with something I cannot change. Death was irreversible and the weather could not be controlled. I looked down as the ground began to crumble upwards in slow motion. An animal of some sort had been hiding from the rain in the ground near my parents' grave, and so I watched as it slowly climbed out from the dirt and lifted its head to stare up at me. A small, beautiful, pure white snake. I looked down at the stunning creature as it slithered to my feet before I lowered my body to reach for it. The snake did not hesitate in climbing my arm with all the patience of a turtle. It coiled around my arm and stopped at my bicep. It curled into my warmth, but I did not find myself disgusted by it. It cuddled against me and yet I only felt a spark of relief in my soul. Confusion filled me as I looked down at the curious thing, and Sensei must have seen it on my face as he chose to speak in that moment. "The white snake," Sensei whispered. I turned to look up at the man to show him I was interested in what he had to say. I wasn't, but it was the polite thing to do. "They say it represents fortune, and rebirth." "Rebirth," I murmured as my heart skipped a beat. Perhaps, the snake felt a kinship with me for living a second life? Was it possible for animals to sense an older soul? It's incredibly lucky that one has come to you, perhaps. Perhaps you are due for some luck in your life, nay? Maybe it is a message to renew yourself. I did not understand what he meant about renewing myself, but I decided to interpret it in my own way. Sometimes, people just didn't make any sense and I found no desire to ask for clarification. I looked at Sensei's hopeful expression and felt a genuine smile lift the edges of my lips. Rebirth. If I had reincarnated, perhaps I can bring my parents back from the dead as well. Sensei? I looked up at the man once more and returned his brightening smile. He seemed proud to have helped me during my time of mourning. That expression looked nice on his face. I did not want to ask him the bubbling questions on whether or not bringing people back to life was possible. I knew that this growing hope was something I'd need to keep secret from him. Bringing people back to life would be against the laws that the Nidaime had created during his reign as Hokage. It was a very specific law, allowing me to make an educated guess towards the reasons for it coming to being. There was a jutsu out there that could bring people back to life, and I needed to find it. Create it. Yes, Orochimaru? Sensei's voice was pleasant to my ears. Perhaps it was because he was the last person I had left that actually liked me for who I was. I took a slow, easy breath and found that my hope was growing stronger. I looked into the mont's ugly monkey eyes and gave him my warmest smile. Thank you. I trained harder than I had before, but kept the training to 3 hours a day so I could spend the rest of my time at the library. I returned the books I'd stolen sneakily and ignored the presence of the two constant stalkers. I had no clue why they would not leave me alone, and some nights I found myself contemplating how I would kill them. I believe if they continued to follow me I would snap. It was only a matter of time. I continued to read scrolls and books about what sciences this world had so far discovered and very soon found myself floundering at the lack of material to study. I had to switch to studying the jutsu in the library until my understanding of jutsu and chakra brought me onto the path of specializing in ninjutsu. Sarutobi Sensei seemed to have assumed I had chosen my specialization and went into full sensei mode in teaching me everything he knew on chakra and ninjutsu. His input was greatly appreciated and I found myself spending more time with him during the days than my other two teammates. He brought me out to eat lunch, and sometimes came over with takeout from the various stalls and restaurants in the village. As time went by I did not find myself any closer to my goal of reincarnating my parents. It was when I was 10 years of age, as the three of us reached Chunin, that inspiration hit me. I did not have any access to kinjutsu in this village and there was no way for me to earn that access for a long time. However, I'd seen how far Jiraiya had come with his studies of fuinjutsu and the odd seals he had created himself over the years. It was fascinating and I could see myself finding ways to summon the dead if what I knew of seals was correct. Seals could do anything the master can conjure in his mind with enough patience and understanding. I was lacking one of those, but I was certain my level of patience could tide me over. So I went to the current master of seals in Konoha to see if she would be willing to teach me what she knew. There was no guarantee that she was taking in anyone since she was still in mourning for her late husband Hashirama, but I truly hoped she gave me a chance. I was teammates with her granddaughter after all, and according to this society, connections were crucial. If she declined, I'd be forced to deal with the idiotic pervert Jiraiya who couldn't seem to keep his eyes off of naked women from the hot springs. Whatever childish emotions that had consumed me as a child to feel hurt by that imbecile was thankfully gone. I cared nothing for the white-haired scoundrel. I made my way to the Senju compound wearing my more traditional clothes that made fighting less advisable lest it rip the delicate fabrics. Dark purple, black and maroon was my current theme, along with the tabi socks and geta to match. I tied my hair at the nape of my neck and let it swing delicately behind me down my spine. My kimono was dark purple, my hakama black, and my haori a beautiful shade of maroon. I had yet to wear this ensemble anywhere, and I found myself pleased at the stares I received as I walked through the village towards the compound. I even painted my perfectly trimmed nails the same purple to match. I felt confident, and it made my smile come easier as I came up to the home Tsunade and Mito shared. I'd yet to meet the woman, but I have seen her around the village during the times that I went grocery shopping. She was as human as anyone else, and it made me mildly nervous. I knocked twice on the sides of the shoji doors and waited as the loud steps of my teammate came to the door and slid it open. She looked shocked still as she looked me over before gaping at my slowly growing smile. Tsunadeheim. I bowed before looking at her. Orochimaru, Tsunade said with disbelief as she let me in. I smiled politely and took off my geta and placed them to the side near the other sets of shinobi boots and geta. What the heck ya doing here? She said suspiciously as she put her hand on her small hip. My teammate had not changed much in the last 4 years. She had barely spoken to me in all our time as a team unless to receive or give orders and complain about Jiraiya. I did not put in any effort in trying to get closer towards her either, so there really wasn't any harm done. Though it seemed the girl still held reservations against me if her suspicious glare was anything to go by. I came to ask Uzumaki-sama if she would allow me a moment of her time. I said respectfully. I was in her home now, and there was no way I'd let myself screw this up by being my emotionally stunted self. HMPH, of course everything's all about gaining something with you, isn't it? Tsunade grumbled as she led the way. I could not dignify that with a response because it was true. Tsunade was good at spotting lies from what I've seen of her and Jiraiya's interactions. I dare not disrespect her with lies. Plus I was doing my best to act halfway normal right now. I did not want to come off as being a completely different person after all. Oba-chan, Tsunade called out as we went down the Ingawa to what I assumed was Mito's room. I looked at the beautiful scenery of their yard and imagined myself living in a beautiful home such as this. The rock garden and the greenery of the trees bordering it, along with the magnificently made dark brown fence. The walkway was bricked with naturally shaped stone and looked like it took weeks to build. The koi fish ponds made the place emit a feel of tranquility, and I found that my calm came easier and faster. The air itself seemed to soothe the anger from my pores and relax me considerably. When we got to Uzumaki's room, I was genuinely smiling with a feeling of peace. The stalkers could not enter the Senju compound. Ah, Tsunade, who is your friend? Uzumaki Mito asked as she looked up from her work. She sat in seiza on a cushion in behind a short table covered with scattered scrolls, papers, and ink. She was dressed in a red kimono with a white apron, and she had smudges of ink on her cheek and fingers. She was breathtakingly beautiful. Her beautiful red hair was tied up in an intricate bun, while 2 exceptionally long bangs framed her face and reached the floor at her sides. Her eyes were a deep violet and her pink lips quirked in a sweet smile as she looked at me with a small lift of her chin. She must have been pushing 70, but she looked no older than 20, and I think my breath caught in my throat. I felt heat on my cheeks and hoped to hell my gray pallor would not let it show. Was she using some sort of age-defying jutsu? I blinked before bowing to the woman politely. Uzumaki-sama, I came to make a request of you if you would hear me out. Tsunade punched me in the arm lightly by her standards and huffed when I winced in response. This is my teammate, his name's Orochimaru. Tsunade introduced. My face heated again in embarrassment for forgetting to say my name first. I was making a fool of myself. Don't you fret, Orochimaru, I've heard of you from my step-brother. Mito smiled warmly. Come sit, I'm a retired kunoichi and don't get visitors often enough. Hi. I went to sit across from her where she gestured and let my eyes roam the papers on the desk curiously. So this was sealing. Bring us some tea, Tsunade dear. Mito smiled. TCH, Tsunade grumbled and stomped off to wherever the kitchen was. She didn't seem to be keen on learning the methods for walking in silence. Though I felt it would not match her personality to have quiet footsteps. So, Orochimaru-kun was it? Tobirama has spoken to me about you briefly. A once-in-a-generation prodigy. Am I correct? Mito asked conversationally. I felt a bit of irritation at the demeaning title but did not let it show on my face. With all due respect, I find that my determination and hard work should not be considered prodigious at all, Uzumaki-sama. I began slowly as I looked down at my folded hands. I have worked hard for what I've learned so far, though I do find that my ability to retain information may be higher than average. Perfectly understandable, our previous Azukage had the same view about his genius as you do. Mito said casually as she slowly began to pick up her papers and stack them neatly. I glanced up at her and felt my face heat up at her proximity before abruptly looking back down at my painted nails. Kami, save me, I'm suffering from puberty. A moment later Tsunade returned and placed the tea in the middle of the now cleared table before going off to do whatever she had been doing before I came here. Mito poured our tea for us delicately, then lifted her own cup with both hands before taking a small sip. I blinked and looked towards my own cup and copied her completely. My mind wandered to Uzumaki Mito's incredibly impossible ability to stay young over the years. In my previous life, most people began to lose their youth by the age of 30 in a downward spiral. I've seen 60-year-olds still looking 40, but never had I seen a 70-year-old woman looking 20. The Uzumaki longevity was beyond my expectations. I could not sense any genjutsu, and the diamond on her forehead did nothing more than collect chakra from the woman's body from what I've read. My curiosity got the best of me and I found myself looking at her from below my eyelashes to study her better. I took another sip from the tea and set it down before regaining my resolve to ask her my question. Uzumaki-sama, I understand that you are a master of fuinjutsu. I began nervously. I was hoping that you wouldn't mind passing off some of that knowledge to me if it isn't too much trouble. I lifted up the cup and took another sip before studying her reaction. Mito was silent for a moment as she looked me over thoughtfully before smiling. Answer me this first, Orochimaru-kun. Why do you want to learn fuinjutsu? My fingers twitched with growing nerves as I swallowed them down and met her curious gaze. I do not find happiness with much in my life, but I have found my passion in learning new things. I have an ambition of sorts, to eventually learn everything there is to know about chakra and its uses. I find that my goal is impossible to complete and it fills me with a despair I cannot be rid of. With fuinjutsu I hope that I may find a way to lengthen my lifespan so that I may continue to learn in this world. I began. A few years ago my parents died in what is assumed to be a domestic violence case, however I find that to be extremely unlikely. With what I've learned so far, I do not think I am any closer to finding a way to discover the real reason behind their deaths. I do not know much about fuinjutsu besides what I've seen my teammate Jiraiya create, but I'm hoping that it can at least help me answer the questions I hold. By bringing them back to life. Mito contemplated my reasons as she slowly finished her tea. Once she was done she put the cup down then smiled warmly at me. My heart skipped a beat at her undivided stare. I don't suppose you want to start now? Mito grinned. Hi. Uzumaki Mito was a healer as well as a fuinjutsu specialist, which in turn made her an exceptional and ideal sensei for me. She was by no means similar to my mother, but she understood me almost on the same level as mother once had. Of course, I'd always been fond of old people myself, even in my previous life, so maybe I was a little biased. Old people were the ones who experienced so much in life and chose not to give up no matter what life threw at them. And I knew for a fact that life would always find ways to ruin any semblance of happiness people find. I respect them because they know exactly how cruel life is, but they can still put on a smile and care for the young and the stupid who are new to life. Of course Uzumaki Mito seemed to have some inherent understanding that I was far more mature than my age suggested and almost immediately began treating me like an adult. She gave me her beginner journals from her childhood when she began her Fuinjutsu training and told me I'd need to write my own study journals as I go in case I ever had a student in the future. I'd make the journals for future reference, but I severely doubted I'd willingly subject myself to the whims of a child at any point in my future. Mito gave me her beginner journals, for a total of 20, which I found ludicrous, before handing me 3 thick textbooks of beginner Uzumaki sealing instructions. Instructed me to read the 3 textbooks first and then read the journals at the spots she marked in the textbooks so everything would be in order. So I spent most of my time at home reading and writing in my own journal, and my time at Mito's being taught calligraphy and practicing it till my hands fell off. She explained I needed to be ambidextrous when it came to sealing in case an enemy cut off one of my hands. A hard lesson her brother had to learn apparently. And the issue where I couldn't look at her for long without my face heating up went away very quickly when she became my sensei. She was far too motherly for my tastes, and her gentle way of scolding unnerved me. Almost as if she'd smack me over the head if I made the same mistake. I always fixed any mistake I made when she used that tone with me. Perhaps she leaked killing intent with her gentle words? I imagine it had something to do with being a 70-year-old woman and the previous wife of the strongest man in history. Good riddance for that pesky emotion. Eventually Tsunade was made to join us and learn the basics. She had expressed her desire to have the strength of the 100 seals that Mito currently had on her forehead and was promptly taught to bare basics. She had a lot less work to do than I did, but I had mentioned to Mito that I wanted to learn everything after all. I dug my own grave, so I may as well lie in it. Unfortunately, not all my time could go into learning the art of Uzumaki sealing since we still had to do missions. Sarutobi-sensei and made the 3 of us a package deal when it came to missions because we worked so well together and we were constantly called to do more and more missions as the war efforts picked up. I made sure to keep my studies close to me using a self-made storage seal placed on my triceps. I suppose mentioning that Sensei became the 3rd Hokage after we all made Chunin should be mentioned, but it had been somewhat of an open secret for years that Tobirama had been wanting him as a successor, so it wasn't important. I should also mention that Tobirama went and offed himself in the war on a suicide mission, but that's not really important either. Mito had been upset for a few days before she went right back into teaching me with as much or even more gusto than before. Meaning she got me to make a shadow clone to read stuff for me while I worked hard to make my calligraphy skills burn into my wrist muscles. The headaches I dealt with every night had been killer until she taught me a few healing jutsu in compensation. I ended up suffering for months before she taught it to me though, which made me wonder if she did that on purpose. It was difficult to be certain, but I gave her the benefit of the doubt. She seemed to find my suspicions adorable though. The years went by and I found it becoming easier and easier to keep calm. Like I was content with how things were, and my surroundings. The garden seemed to really have a healing quality to it, and I hoped to find the reasons why in the intermediate textbooks. The feeling of tranquility was so deep set in my bones that I found myself smiling more often every day, and happily ignoring the stalkers that never failed to follow me after I left the Senju compound for the night. I was able to put up strong security seals in my home on every surface to keep intruders out, and found my home soon becoming filled with various objects and books. I had transformed my parents' room into a study with wall shelves, a short table and a few cushions, and 3 bookshelves on each wall besides the one with the door on it. I carved shelves into the walls of the living room and filled them with all the books I collected, bought and stole from missions and other people's homes over the years, and eventually expanded my home a little to create a basement where I had built myself a lab based on what I knew from my previous life. I had a good handle on Doden Jutsu, so it wasn't much of an effort. I even used some basic science to create diamonds, and it wasn't really difficult. Just needed to compress and heat the earth with some of the strongest jutsus I knew. I had to alter them a little to have a stronger effect in a smaller area, but it worked quite well. I made my floor into sparkly diamonds in my basement, along with the walls and the roof. It would be very stable to all manner of attack since diamond had been known as one of the toughest materials in the world in my previous dimension. It also made for a sterile environment so my experiments wouldn't be contaminated from outside sources. The entrance to my secret lab was placed under my cushion in my study. Also sealed. "Hey, Orochi-teme?" Jiraiya said with a tone in his voice I'd never heard before. It almost sounded apologetic, and wasn't that a surprise? I looked up from my romance novel I'd been reading for some mindless relaxation and raised an eyebrow at the white-haired teenager. Puberty had blessed Jiraiya and made his growth spurt, and voice change swift and natural. One week he was still a child, the next he was a young man, and everyone seemed to notice. Jiraiya at 14 was turning heads, but I could see he was completely oblivious. A complete ignoramus. Of course, his only focus had ever really been secretly looking at naked women, not fully dressed women. There was surely something wrong in the boy's brain, and I had no desire to get into it to find out. Jiraiya just looked at me and shifted silently from his spot across the fire pit. Tsunade was already sleeping comfortably in her sleeping bag to the left of us, and Jiraiya should have already been asleep. It was my watch after all. I gave out a long-suffering sigh before snapping my book shut and placing it in my storage seal. "Yes, Jiraiya?" I said quietly as I looked up at his fidgety form. I had been leaning sideways on a perfect resting rock I'd created with a Doden Jutsu earlier, so I moved a little to gain more warmth from it. The heat from the fire had done a great job. I wanted to apologize. He mumbled as he twiddled his thumbs before looking at me nervously. I felt my hackles rise in suspicion. "What have you done?" Jiraiya's eyes widened before he gave me a sheepish smile and rubbed the back of his head. Nothing. I was talking about from when we were kids. I know you're still hung up on it." I leaned back into the rock and narrowed my eyes at the idiotic man. "You were a child." I rolled my eyes. "I'm over it, Jiraiya." "All right." He hesitated. "Then why do you still hate me?" I chuckled before turning my gaze away from him and looking up at the cave ceiling. "I don't hate you. In fact, I don't feel anything in particular towards you at all besides the basic trust of a Konoha comrade." Jiraiya wilted before shuffling his way around the fire and sitting behind me. I sensed him shiver from the cold a minute later before I sighed and looked at him once more. I paused when I noticed his strangely intense gaze. "I want to be your friend," he stated firmly. I blinked and looked into his eyes, noticing the way his gaze fell to my lips before going back to my eyes with a firm nod as if forcing a thought from his mind. I tilted my head and watched as his tanned skin seemed to darken on his cheeks. I recognized that look, of course. I'd seen the look multiple times in women from my past life and usually went along with it for curiosity. Having was a more primal part of human interaction, and I wasn't as disgusted with it as with hugs and mushy conversations from those touchy types of people. Did not last long after all, and always seemed to sat a part of me. It helped that most of the people I'd had within my previous life had been one-night stands, except for that tiresome woman that humiliated me and caused me to commit drunken suicide. I lifted myself up to rest on my palms and slowly moved closer to Jiraiya experimentally and nearly smiled in triumph when he did not move. In fact, the boy seemed determined to keep his eyes on mine until I agreed with him. Perhaps he assumed I was about to try and intimidate him. He would be right, though I'd be using a different method. Perhaps it would scare him off and leave me alone. He obviously did not seem comfortable with wanting me if his previous actions over the years were put into perspective. I erased the space between our faces and brought my lips to his in a careful kiss, my left hand coming up to hold his neck and jaw to keep him still until he either gave in or backed off. Jiraiya seemed to flounder in shock as his hands fluttered around as if he did not know where to put them. I moved my lips against his slowly before taking his bottom lip between mine and biting it. He gasped, and I took advantage to put my tongue in his mouth and deepen the kiss. Ah, lemon candy. With Edo Tensei I now had the method to summon the souls using DNA as an anchor. It was only a matter of time now. Soon my parents' bodies will be finished their growth and I can begin the first trails. Of course my first tests are going to be made using Tobirama and Hashirama. It hadn't been all that difficult to get Tobirama's DNA when his distinctive white hair had been all over his clothes Mito had kept. I looked at the aging face of my sensei and wondered when he started looking so old. He'd yet to hit 40 and yet he looked like a 55-year-old man with his graying hair and wrinkles on his face. It must be the stress of the job. Hashirama never had to lead a war as Hokage and Tobirama had died in the middle of the First Shinobi War and neither of them had looked very old though they'd been known to have reached their early 60s before their deaths. Sensei had become Hokage during the middle of a harsh and long drawn-out war and it had physically aged the poor man with stress and guilt from assigning suicide missions. "Please don't ever make me Hokage, Sensei." I shuddered before taking another sip of tea. He looked up from my journal and smiled wryly at me. You were my best candidate till now actually. He admitted as he put the book down before gulping back the last of his tea. Good, perhaps this whole Danzo deal had some good come of it after all. I huffed. I loathed the thought of leading an entire village. It does get tough. Sensei nodded before putting his chin on his hands. Tell me, did you realize that Danzo was planning to use you as a scapegoat after finishing this project? My grip on my cup tightened a little. It had not occurred to me that you didn't know about my research, Sensei. I fully believed everything I was doing in this project was legal. I grunted before grabbing the initial mission request from my seal and handing it to him. These were the parameters for my mission and the rewards I was given in exchange. Sensei nodded, then took the scroll and opened it and read its contents. His eyes widened when he saw the seal of the Hokage on the bottom as well as his own signature. I see, he breathed. This is incriminating evidence. Did you know that messages like this are meant to be burned once read? I've never taken missions higher than a rank, Sensei, you know that. I also never retrieved Anbu training. I did not think to burn the mission request. I've been collecting things in my seal for years and simply forgetting about them. Well, that bad habit just saved your life. Danzo was executed. I was flabbergasted when I heard the news myself, in all honesty. I'd been hiding out in my home lab for a few months after the talk with Sensei and using the research I'd made to look over the 4 floating bodies in my tanks. They were children-sized now, and I found myself growing slightly impatient to begin the first trails already. Every day I watched and continued my maintenance of the bodies so they wouldn't die of simple things like needing sustenance. They were nothing but soulless husks at this point, but they were alive. I had never seen my father with long hair before, and I found it made him look surprisingly girly. He had been a buff type of man when I grew up, and now I could see why he had worked so hard to gain muscles like that, even though bodybuilding in that manner is detrimental to speed for shinobi. Though now I can see where my gentle jaw came from, along with my long delicate fingers. My mother was an androgynous as always, even with long hair. She had sharp eyes and a pointed nose and lips that looked entirely too mischievous for the type of woman I knew she was. Her gray skin and purple clan markings around her eyes made her look similar to me, but that was where the similarities ended. I looked entirely like my father, though my eyes had a sharper curve than his. I got the best of both of them. I dragged my eyes away to look at the 2 mini Hokage. Hashirama looked dorky as a child, with eyes too big for his face and wide lips. He eventually grew into his oversized mouth and eyes, but I imagine he spent a great deal of his childhood feeling self-conscious. Tobirama was the complete opposite. His face was far too beautiful to be fair, with a small pointed chin, thick lashes over narrow eyes and a perfectly proportioned mouth and nose. The white hair only made him more exotic. I returned to my journal and scribbled a few paragraphs before deciding it was time to go out into the world and buy some groceries. I hadn't even been sending shadow clones out for Mito's training anymore. I wasn't too sure how she'd feel about her apprentice playing around with her dead husband's body, so I didn't go to find out. Hiruzen was planning to lay it all out after all. I tidied up a little before climbing the ladder to my study before closing the trapdoor behind me and placing the pillow on top for perfection. I stood and began stripping out of my 4-day worn yukata, cleaned myself up before changing into my regular shinobi clothes. My white haori with dark blue obi, fish net shirt, dark gray shinobi pants, and calf-high shinobi boots. I hid my weapons on my person and made my way to the market with my head held high and wariness in my eyes. I ignored the whispers as I took my usual route through the stalls before stopping at the stall that had the best dango. I had a particular fondness for the plump, partially sweet dough, and the craving for it came too quickly and too hard for me to overcome. 20 sticks of dango, I said calmly as I looked up at the sign. I looked at the different types of sweets and tea and contemplated getting something more before pulling out the required ryo to hand to the shopkeep. I looked up at the same time shopkeep man did and watched as he froze, his eyes widening in disbelief before he squealed loudly. "Or Orochimaru-sama," the man stuttered. "I couldn't dare take your money. Not after what you've done for this village. Oh boy, here, I'll have your order done in a jiffy, just you wait, Orochimaru-sama." I put my money back and nodded before sitting on the stool before leaning on the high-leveled table and resting my chin on my open palm. I ignored the stares of the civilians and relaxed at the feeling of no longer having those pesky stalkers. I also ignored the niggling worry of Mito and Tsunade hating me and took a small easy breath and drooped my eyes lazily to stare at the people walking past. I felt a tug on the edge of my haori and slowly looked down at the small yellow-haired thing staring up at me with starry blue eyes. Orochimaru-sama? The child asked with an innocent tone only children could use. He looked to be about the same size as my test tube cages. Did you need something from me, tiny human? I asked as I leaned down and rested my elbows on my knees. It put my face at his height so he could talk easier, and by the sparkle in his eyes he seemed to appreciate it. Yes, the boy started with a surprising amount of maturity. My name is Minato Namikaze and I've read all your texts and I was wondering if you would help me with a few things I don't understand? No one seems to know anything more about the biology of organisms you write about and I really wanted to learn. I looked the child over curiously before putting my hand on his head. Minato peeked at me behind his ruffled bangs without an ounce of apprehension on his features. Most people, much less children, would assume they didn't have the right to go and ask high-level ninja questions. The boy was brave, smart enough to read my texts and understand them, and seemed to ooze kindness and charisma. Definitely of a different breed. Very well, tiny human. I'll be taking you to my home, so if you have any parents or guardians and whatnot you should inform them you won't be returning for lunch and supper. I agreed as I ruffled the child's yellow hair, leaving behind large messy spikes. Minato seemed to sparkle as he bounced on his heels. I don't have parents, he said excitedly before he deflated and remembered he didn't have parents. I almost laughed at hilarity of his emotional switch but held it back with an amused smile. Well then, I turned and grabbed the box filled with dango before grabbing the child with my other arm and lifting him up on my hip. We can just head there now. Minato let out a small squeak as I jumped up onto the roof and began a slow roof hop towards my home. I felt his tiny hands clutch at my clothes and smiled a little before frowning at the incoming chakra signature. Jiraiya? I paused on a flat roof and turned to the direction Jiraiya was coming from and let the child down. The boy looked around before tilting his head up at me and blinking with confusion. A moment later Jiraiya flickered in front of us with a pile of leaves and a wide breathtaking smile. Sometimes it pissed me off how handsome the man had grown to be. I was sure it had to do with the fact he'd grown half a foot taller than I and there was no way I'd ever catch up. Who's the Gaki? Jiraiya asked as he kneeled on his haunches and looked the kid over. I looked at the large scroll on my teammate's back and grimaced at the scent of toads coming off his skin. The scent was appalling and made me scrunch up my nose in disgust. Minato Namikaze. Minato introduced himself warily. He looked up at me as if to ask me who the weirdo was. I smirked at that before narrowing my eyes at the now toad-scented man. Why are you here, Jiraiya? I asked him sourly. Jiraiya winced at my tone before smiling sheepishly at me. I narrowed my eyes at him when his eyes roved over my figure hungrily before turning friendly once more. Alright, Sensei's been waiting on you to come out of your den. He wants to speak to you about the thing, he said as he gestured to the tower. I looked at him blandly so he'd clarify but he just looked at the child then back at me as if I'd understand what that means. You know, the thing. I raised an eyebrow, taking a shot in the dark. Jiraiya blushed bright red before flailing his arms around. No. Oh Kami, why would he be interested in that? Jiraiya floundered. Oi, and I thought we weren't mentioning that. Mentioning what? I countered with an innocent tilt of my head recently copied from Minato. Jiraiya just blinked at me before huffing in defeat. Just come on, Sensei wants to see you Orochi-teme. He slumped. Lead the way. I gestured before picking up the child once more. Minato didn't object as he quickly took hold of my haori and grinned with childish glee. Jiraiya gave the kid a skeptical look before turning and heading towards the tower with me at his heels. Then we executed him publicly. Sensei finished as I stood across from him with a 4-year-old on my hip. Yes, public humiliation then death. I hissed fondly, remembering my own death for a moment. Though I am curious how funding experiments with Hashirama's cadaver is a cause for death. Minato's eyes were bright with happiness for who knows what reasons. Sensei put his face in his hand and sighed deeply. Sometimes my boy, I wonder why you are my favorite student. Likewise, I replied blandly. Sensei looked up at me after a moment before blinking at the child in my arms. What's that? He asked dumbly. I furrowed my eyebrows at the slow-witted question. He's a child, Sensei. I explained slowly, to make sure he understands. Sensei's eyeball twitched as he looked at me before looking at the child expectantly. My name is Minato Namikaze. Minato introduced himself for the third time that day. And why are you here, Minato-kun? Sensei asked the child before giving me an accusing glare. I huffed, feeling affronted at the pointless expression. There was absolutely no need to look at me as if I'd done anything wrong. I've never done anything wrong. Orochimaru sensei was going to take me to his house when Jiraiya brought us here. What's with you and taking children home? Jiraiya said as he threw his hands up in the air. I gave the man a glare at his sudden need to bring up the past. He had a good 14 years to talk about this and he chose to do this now? The only child I brought home was you, for all the bad luck that brought me. I'm taking this one home because he's not like the snot-infested rugrats that regularly infest this village. I hissed out before shifting Minato higher on my hip. I pointedly looked at him to let him know that he was a snot-infested rugrat. Will you be apprenticing him then? Sensei asked as he folded his hands on his desk. He seemed to be pleased at the prospect, if his small smile meant anything. Yes, Minato jolted. I blinked and looked at the child. He was acting as if I'd offered him an apprenticeship myself and it was a done deal. I hummed a response. I suppose I could use a new assistant. The last 3 were barely useful for testing my aphrodisiacs. Minato stilled, then looked up at me in horror. Afro what? I rolled my eyes at his childish fear. Don't worry, Hatching, you won't be used in my experiments. You'll be helping me perform them. I assured the child. That reminds me, Sensei, I need some cadavers. I'll need to teach the child from scratch, and anatomy is easier with an actual human to cut up. There was silence for a second as I waited for a response for any of the 3 people in the room. Jiraiya suddenly plucked the child from my arm, then held him away from me before looking at me in horror. You can't just teach 4-year-olds how to cut up dead bodies. Sensei, I'll teach the Gaki instead. Jiraiya declared as he lifted Minato up by his armpits and grinned at him. Minato grimaced in response. He already looks like a future toad sage to me. I snatched the child back with a few well-placed flickers and hissed at him. All he'd learned from you is how to run from your issues to the beds of harlots, I said with all the venom I could manage. Though I held back on exuding any killing intent for the sake of the child now hugging me in relief. Well, all he'd learned from you is how to dress like a girl and trick guys into. Jiraiya argued back angrily. My anger spiked at his idiotic accusation. You half-witted, obtuse fool. If tricking you only takes a kiss, then I fear for your future. I bet. You should fear for yourself. You're so damn trusting that you'd get manipulated into anything. The stupid man pulling arguments from his ass now. Then perhaps I should stop trusting. A buffoon like you would only take it and crush it the next day like you've always fucking done. I growled. I turned to Sensei and his gaping expression before huffing haughtily. This child is mine. Sensei looked between the fuming Jiraiya and myself before pulling out a paper and writing something down and stamping it. Done. I'll have the Anbu deliver some cadavers in a few days. Thank you, Sensei. I smiled before looking at Jiraiya smugly and turning on my heel, my hair whipping his face as I left. I gave him my journals I created for all my experiments and set him up in my old room. If he had questions, he came down into the lab to talk as I did my experiments. I expanded my basement to include a new room for myself, which made taking breaks from my work easier since I'd only need to walk 6 feet to my bed when I got tired. I gave the eager child a training regime much like my old one when I was 4, and taught him all the basics I had learned from father. He picked things up at a faster pace than I'd ever managed, which left a small twinge of jealousy in my heart, but I was mostly grateful. The boy was quite inventive as well, and I found myself learning things from him during some of our spars. He also made sure to drag me outside into the yard every day for sunbathing. It was something I hadn't done since my visits with Mito ended, and I was very grateful to the cheerful and kind child. I'd never met a child that was so inherently kind before. Somehow it felt like the child was sent by Kami to prove to me that not all children were evil little nitwits. Then I'd see a group of children his age being evil little nitwits and that thought would vanish. Minato was the exception, I supposed. Though he wasn't all that fazed about cutting up the cadavers for learning anatomy like I assumed he would be. He had been calm, calculating, and his generally cheerful self. He asked what each organ was, what they did, and why they did what they did with the curiosity of a happy child. It pleased me. I gave him chakra control exercises and he completed them on his own in 2 weeks, so I taught him some medical ninjutsu so he could put the cadavers back together. That took him a month, but with his exceptional learning capability he managed to make a cut-up cadaver look good as new. He was enthusiastic, and very touchy for a child. Had no concept of personal space, but I found I didn't mind it too much. Some children just needed affection like that to grow into good people, and I was not adverse in helping the child become a better person than he already was. Teaching the child also helped me deal with my urge to hurry up and bring the Hokages back to life. Some days I'd sit in front of the tanks and just force myself to stop wanting to jump the gun. My soul summoning jutsu was hardly perfected just yet, but rats and rabbits weren't helping me with getting anything accurate. Finally I gave up and consulted Minato on how we should continue with this experiment. Though I did not expect the answer I got. Well, the rabbits have been inconclusive because you can't tell if the same soul returned to the rabbit you'd killed. This type of jutsu would need to start with human testing rather than animal testing, making it a kinjutsu. Perhaps starting with the Hokages would be a bad idea, since this jutsu looks to have a high chance of succeeding. I wouldn't want to piss them off. Minato suggested as he looked at my notes. High chance of succeeding? I urged as I looked over his shoulder to see if we were seeing the same things. You have a lot of fuinjutsu notes in your experiment journals and I picked it up. From what I can see here, Minato pointed at the left part of the summoning seal. And here, he pointed to the right. This seal looks altogether stable and secured to the DNA you used this seal on. I imagine the only thing that would stop this from working was the possibility of reincarnation existing. Perhaps a child somewhere in the world will randomly become deceased, I said with a chuckle. Minato smiled at me with something like fondness in his gaze before looking back at the journal and humming. Well, no pain no gain, right? Let's revive the Hokage. They're still child-sized, I protested weakly. Then they'll be child-sized Hokages. Minato shrugged before putting down the journal on the diamond counter and going to the tanks with excitement. I sighed as my excitement began to rise as well. Very well, drain the tanks, I said as I looked closely at the child-sized cages. In the last 2 years I'd incubated the things they'd grown to be about 10 or so in age. In another year they'd most likely be fully grown, but I was far too worked up to wait any longer. At least Hashirama looked a little less like a dopey idiot. Once the 2 tanks were drained I gathered the sticky husks and put them on the metal gurney before cleaning their bodies with a quick jutsu. Minato came back with a couple of my old training yukatas and we quickly dressed them up. Finally, as my heart raced in anticipation, I performed the jutsu. Then I performed it once more on the other child and went to stand by Minato patiently. Tobirama moved first, a twitch of his finger, while Hashirama moved a minute later with a twitch of his toe. Minato and I looked at each other, and I have no idea but I'm pretty sure I'm grinning just as widely as he is. They're alive, Minato exclaimed before doing his best impression of an evil genius cackle. I certainly didn't teach him that. Enough, Minato, you're bringing shame upon yourself in front of 2 child-sized Hokage. I scolded. Hi, sensei. Minato gave me a closed-eyed smile. Of course the child was completely unrepentant. Tobirama sighed before slowly sitting up and looking at his surroundings. Before his gaze stopped on his brother. Hashi? Hashirama blinked his eyes open in response before grinning and sitting up to tackle his brother. Toby. They tangled themselves onto the floor at our feet and flounders a little before Tobirama got the upper hand. Baka, we've just been revived, show some restraint. Tobirama grunted before shoving his fist on his brother's head. Ooh. So mean, Tobirama. Hashirama whined before he blinked and looked up at us. Both boys were sprawled on the floor after their little tussle. None of them seemed generally worried for their safety, but I put that to being how strong they were rather than any trust for Minato and I. Hi, I'm Minato Namikaze. Minato introduced himself happily as he went to help them both get up. Hashirama smiled back and took his hand gratefully while Tobirama seemed grudgingly accepting. They both decided to take in their surroundings curiously. This is, Tobirama said with a deep frown as he looked at his unblemished skin. He looked at me before his eyes widened in recognition. Orochimaru. Ah, so you remember me, Naidame-sama. I smiled as I pulled Minato back. I'd strengthened their bodies with the enhancement formulas I'd created using Hashirama's cells, so the both of them should actually feel a lot stronger than they did while they were alive. Even as 10-year-olds. Of course I do. I've never seen a genius quite like you in all my years. Tobirama said, as if it were obvious. Then he looked at me suspiciously. Why have you brought us here? I glanced at Hashirama, who was busy wandering around the lab and looking at all the equipment with barely hidden intrigue. He seemed content to leave all the talking to his younger brother. Minato followed my gaze and went to Hashirama to happily talk about my lab as if he'd been the one to create everything. I don't have much use for the two of you now that I know the jutsu worked. Though if you'd answer a few questions for me. Very well. Tobirama acquiesced with a nod of his head. His suspicion seemed to have vanished in a second, but I figured it was his high level and ability to see through lies. With all the experience this man had, I did not doubt for 1 second that I could tell a single lie to him. He tucked his small hands in his sleeves and looked up at me with the same blank stare he'd used while posing for the statue makers. He still managed to look intimidating even at 10 years old, but I contributed that to the fact I knew what those bodies could do. I'd created them after all. He could punt me through my diamond wall. I pulled out my journal and began asking him some basic medical examination questions before getting to the thick of things and asking how his new body felt. His answers were everything I had hoped for. The jutsu was perfect. 100% success rate. The best part about it was it didn't need a sacrifice when there were perfect clone husks for the souls to inhabit. I closed the journal with a snap before giving Minato a look that meant, make food now or else. On it, Minato grinned before going to the ladder and crawling up to the first floor. Hashirama looked back at his brother then smiled before using a flicker to follow Minato. Tobirama flickered after him. I wondered briefly if it was alright to leave Minato to the two child-sized Hokage before shrugging and tidying up a few things in the lab. I joined them upstairs where Minato was making enough food for everyone to munch on a few minutes later. Hashirama and Tobirama were occupied with the bookshelves that covered the entire span of all my walls. They didn't seem particularly upset about being brought back to life. The two of them looked quite peaceful with their current circumstances, so I took that as an indication that I wasn't going to get in trouble for inventing a new kinjutsu that brought people back to life. I was rather giddy about the whole thing. If this had been any other world it would most likely be impossible, but chakra can do almost anything here. The sheer amount of possibility that existed here was beyond anything I could have ever dreamed. Oddly enough, the Hokages felt no need to go anywhere just yet. The both of them had lazed around in my living room just reading books from my collection and reminiscing. Sometimes Minato would ask them questions about something shinobi related and it would lead to a grand debate between the brothers before they decided to take it upon themselves to teach Minato. I didn't feel comfortable bringing my parents back to life when their bodies weren't fully grown yet, so I distracted myself with other things that I'd been wanting to do. Discovering and curing diseases became something of a pastime for me since that was hilariously easy with the types of medicines and plants available here. But there were also little inventions that I had begun creating and introducing to the world using seals and jutsu. Most of the things I created was paperwork related, such as staples, pens, pencils, erasers, markers, paperclips, and all those types of things. It did not make much sense to me that everyone still used wax, ink pots and brushes, when there was such a thing as styrofoam, plastic, and chalk. I sold the journals with how to make them to the highest bidder. Unfortunately, all good things needed to come to an end, considering Suna and Iwe had decided they didn't like how advanced Konoha's technology was becoming in the medical field. They declared war after my idiot of a sensei told them he wouldn't send me to their villages to teach their shinobi how to make medicines for their people. It was idiotic because I would have done it. I'd been growing bored of tiredly recreating things from my old world. To bring Konoha up to speed and a change of pace was exactly the stimulation I needed. I hadn't learned very much in the past few years. I'd just been teaching Minato, and looking after a couple lazy Hokage who liked reading, eating, sleeping, and having philosophy talks. I'd also been hesitating on bringing my parents to life, despite their bodies reaching 18 months ago. Of course, I stopped the injections of Hashirama's growth serum and left them to age at a less than normal human pace. With the current bodies, they'd live far longer than they otherwise would have in their natural bodies. In fact, I estimated the lifespan of the clone bodies to be near 200. I was nervous to see them again, worried over how they'd think of me, or if they'd mind being brought back to life. Excuses I knew, but I could not stop thinking the worst. Minato didn't push me either. The boy seemed to have an intrinsic understanding of my emotions, as unnerving as that was. For now I put the thought of my parents in the back of my mind and went to the Hokage's office for my debrief on our upcoming mission. I left Minato in the now teen-sized Hokage's care without much worry. The three of them seemed to get along quite well, and Minato seemed to enjoy being trained by them. The boy would be a monster one day. I hopped in through the window and paused when I saw two red-haired shinobi with the Uzushio headband beside my teammates. My mind flashed to Mito for a moment before I looked at my teammates and studied their growths. From their thick chakra I could tell they were breaching S rank. The way they both held themselves solidified that theory. I hadn't seen Jiraiya since I began training Minato, since I hadn't left the grounds of my home. I always sent Minato to do all our errands in the house. Tsunade I hadn't seen in nearly 4 years, and shadow clones don't count. I never could bring myself to face her after discovering my research with her grandfather's corpse had not been sanctioned. Her and Mito both. I knew it was wrong to study the bodies of my friends' relatives, and yet I'd never thought twice about it. An odd sense of guilt filled me, and it's been a very long time since it has. I hadn't felt guilty since my last life when I punched that child 2 years my junior for stumbling into my sand castle. The look I'd gotten from my parents and older siblings that day had followed me for the rest of my life. Experimenting on the Shodem's body was perhaps much worse than punching a 3-year-old in the face. Probably. I stepped into the room slowly and cautiously before moving to stand beside Jiraiya with all the grace of a cat. He turned and gave me a wink, and I frowned in confusion. What in world was that for? Good, nice to finally see you out of your den, Orochimaru. Sensei smiled warmly. Your research has been making waves around here, and you've saved hundreds of lives. A feeling of pleased pride filled me at his praise, so I smiled in response. Of course, you can't expect any less from me after all. I agreed readily. Sensei laughed before he looked at his other 2 students approvingly. Though I hadn't been trying to make a joke. I always came out of interactions wondering what I'd done to make him laugh. I'd never understand. I straightened when Sensei began speaking in his cage voice. I'll be sending the 5 of you to aim where the battle is reaching its peak. You'll be in charge of retrieving the wounded from the thick of things, then going further and regaining the war prisoners. One such goes by the moniker White Fang. From there you'll be taking charge of the front-line fighters and taking aim completely to build a base. I'm giving you 3 years to complete the mission and return with a treaty from a Megacure and Iwa running with its tail between its legs. Sensei said with all the confidence of Kami himself. A well of excitement filled me with the introduction of a new challenge, and I found myself grinning at my teammates. You can count on us, Sensei. Jiraiya nodded as he took the scroll with the plans made between Junin Commander Shikako Nara and our Sandame. Good, you'll be leaving tomorrow at noon at the latest. Prepare yourselves. Hi Hokage-sama, the 5 of us chorused. The smell of toad was clogging my senses. My brain was running a mile a minute telling me I was teammates with someone who should be on my plate and fried with onions. Then I'd be disgusted at the thought of cannibalism before the smell of toad returned with Jiraiya's slight brush against my shoulder and my mouth would salivate. I hissed at the man every time he tried to get close, and he seemed increasingly amused by it. I doubted he understood how uncomfortable his presence made me. He seemed to be under the assumption that I was playing hard to get if his pornographic trash he called novels were any indication. I'd seen a scene just like this in one of his earlier works, but I knew with a certainty that it was not going to end in the way he planned. If anything, it would end up in stir-fried toad legs. My mind flashed to the thought of Jiraiya's severed legs in a pan, and a small laugh escaped me as we were halfway to aim. It got me a few startled looks, but the others chose to ignore it. Speaking of the others, the Uzumaki were a surprise on this mission. It wasn't often that Uzushio and Konoha shinobi did missions together. Last I'd heard, relations hadn't been as strong as previously when Mito became the wife of our first Hokage. I was unsure what had caused the change to the point where Uzushio shinobi were traveling to Konoha to assist us in the war. Just this morning I'd seen 20 different redheads all around town before we were sent off on our mission, and my curiosity was begging me to go up to my new teammates to ask them why. In fact, why was I hesitating in this? I barged my way in between the 2 Uzumaki with all the subtlety of a snake before clearing my throat. The 2 startled and gasped before looking at each other, then back at me with bafflement. Orochimaru-sama-san, sir? Kishiko Uzumaki spluttered as his face reddened to a shade brighter than his crimson locks. Nagisa looked absolutely star-struck at my proximity, and her mouth wouldn't stop opening and closing as if struggling with words in general. I glanced at the girl and labeled her useless in my mind before looking at the boy and giving him my sweetest smile I'd stolen from Minato that one time I'd bought him his very own haori. Kishiko-kun, was it? I asked pleasantly, my voice utterly unfamiliar using the higher-pitched tone of friendliness. I hadn't bothered acting nice in years, but I wasn't rusty. If Kishiko's excited grin was anything to go by. Hi. It's a pleasure to be doing a mission with you, Orochimaru-sama. The boy said honestly. I couldn't really be sure he was still a boy with the longevity of Uzumaki genes, but the boy was willing to take a lesser status than me if his attitude was any indication. It should be, I was rarely wrong about interactions such as these. Likewise, if I may inquire. I paused for dramatic effect because movies had been my lifeline in learning how to act in my past life. Why is Uzushio sending its shinobi to assist Konoha in the war efforts? Jiraiya scoffed. Have you been living under a rock, Orochi Teme? Ignore the oaf, I assured Kishiko. The boy looked at Jiraiya for a moment before nodding and turning to me with a willing smile. He had a charming crooked-toothed smile. I felt a small spark of interest pull into my gut at the sight of it. Hey, we ignored him. Well, it's mostly due to all the work you've done, Orochimaru-sama. Your seals are revolutionizing in its ingenuity, and it's improved the livelihood of our shinobi and civilians alike by leaps and bounds. Our Izukage has been sending us to Konoha to create better relations with you for years. I tilted my head before wondering how my small inventions could have helped Uzushio so much. I had identified and made cures to nearly every disease Konoha had ever struggled with. I invented all the useful knick-knacks my world had used for paperwork because writing my journals had been a pain with inkpots and brushes. I created hygiene products simply because my hair had been getting split ends and dried out, as well as skin products so I wouldn't get negative effects from sunbathing every day. I'd also created colored bath bombs and left little diamonds in each one and sold them for phenomenal prices, but they always managed to sell out faster than I could make them. The bath bombs were the only invention I hadn't sold the rights to. I'd needed to make money somehow to fuel my research after all. I'd created better cleaning products since Konoha's version of cleanliness did not match mine, and I would never stand for that. Then there was my basic medic manual I'd rewritten so the hospital would understand it was not okay to reuse needles 3 times on 3 separate people. Perhaps it was the manual on how to grow and cultivate different foods and plants in different habitats so I'd have better tasting carrots? The foods they'd called fruits and vegetables had been terribly bland and in no way nutritious when compared with what I'd been used to in my previous life. You'd think chakra would make the food taste better, but with the methods they'd used, most of the food had been withered from improper cultivation. What kind of idiots were so far behind in technology while having styrofoam and plastic and electricity? They didn't even understand that weeds would hinder the growth of all plants. It was an impossibility that I figured had more to do with conspiracy rather than stupidity. Perhaps the daimyo were hoarding knowledge and purposely leaving the rest of the world in the Dark Ages. In my world, plant cultivation had been studied and improved in a span of 10,000 years, and here it seems to have stagnated at, seed goes into earth, pray for growth. Chakra could have been the culprit in all of this as well, considering every living being relied on it to survive. Perhaps there was a keke genke somewhere called plastic release and styrofoam release. I'd also created manuals on how to look after cows, chickens, pigs, and other basic animals humans used for sustenance. I could not stand the taste of the meats available in the market, which had led me to hunting for food on my own, which wasted my valuable time. So I forced the farmers to treat their livestock better. Livestock that lived in fear their whole lives made for sour-tasting beef. I should also mention that the refrigerator was a thing that existed. However, the methods of shipping foods from the farms to Konoha in warm weather had led to foods having an incredibly short shelf life, where 80% of the food created was thrown in the trash. I didn't do much, I said honestly. Many of the things I'd introduced to these plebeians were basic. I'd had to use seals to invent iceboxes for travel, calming seals for livestock, barrier seals that improved plant growth for farmers, since I doubted any of them would actually pick up my books on how to farm, as well as my tiny seals for my pens and such to make the ink unlimited. I'd had to use seals and jutsu for nearly everything because I did not have the methods to create them naturally. However, I did write down how to do these things naturally without seals for the civilians who didn't use the chakra they were born with. I found that little bit of knowledge to be absolutely blasphemous. There were people in this world who chose not to use their magic like chakra. Unbelievable. You didn't do much. Kishiko gaped. He seemed bewildered. You basically reshaped the lifestyles of everyone in all the shinobi nations. Everyone wants the things you've invented, and it's the reason we're having this war right now. Do you know there's an SSS rank bounty on your head in every village for you alive? I blinked at his enthusiastic response and thought back to the last updated version of the bingo book. Ah yes, that's completely absurd. I was insulted that they'd think so little of me. I am worth far more than their Ryo can buy. I huffed haughtily. Then I flipped my hair for good measure. TCH, Jiraiya grumbled. Drama queen. I narrowed my eyes at him with a warning hiss and he shuddered before looking away with a nervous smile. Good, it seemed he understood that he was prey. If you don't mind my asking. Orochimaru-sama. How much do you think you're worth? Kishiko asked hopefully. I looked back at Kishiko and felt the urge to tease and test him. I did not deny myself. I said thoughtfully. It depends on which part of me you want, as well as what you want me for, Kishiko-kun. I smirked. I'd heard this line in a novel before in my past life and I'd always wanted to use it. Kishiko's response was simply delightful. Kishiko blushed bright red as his eyes widened in incredulity. Oh all of you? He said nervously. He gulped, then looked over my body before his face grew another shade of red. All of me, him? I smiled deviously. For how long? What will you be doing with me? The innuendo was thick, but I always found conversations like this pleasant. It pleased me that people looked at me with lust when I spoke like this. It hiked up my ego and gave me a confidence that lasted for days. Aha. Ha. He laughed nervously and looked around for a way out. I frowned a little at that and wondered if I'd been wrong in reading the social case again. Nagisa chose that time to chime in excitedly, showing how innocent the girl was. I turned at the sound of her voice, feeling annoyed at her interruption. We'd be happy to have you to teach us what you know for a few months. She said with a chipper voice that pinged at my ears like bells. What an infuriating pitch. I studied the girl carefully before turning my nose up at her. She did not have any redeeming features besides the shoulder-length red hair, and I would never find her attractive with that irritating voice. Nagisa, I don't indulge in threesomes. I said calmly before turning to Kishiko. I'd prefer it if it were just the two of us. I said to the red-faced teen. All good, I wasn't mistaken. I find it to be more rewarding to have all the focus on myself rather than shared with another. Nagisa looked put out but nodded as if she completely understood. I glanced at her and wondered at her age before scoffing and turning to Kishiko with growing interest. He was completely out of his element and I found the lack of experience he possessed in this subject endearing. It helped that he had a cute smile despite the rest of him being a little lackluster. Once we reached the rocky tundra of Ain, we set up camp near some medium-sized cliffs. I used a simple Doden jutsu to carve out a ventilated cave with a door that looked as if nothing was there when closed. Nagisa and Kishiko went around putting some seals on the walls with what looked like the markers I'd invented years ago. It was definitely a new way to use my markers and I found myself vexed that I hadn't thought to do that myself. How many years of painstakingly grinding my own chakra ink into ink pots? I grumbled under my breath and I stomped my feet, changing the cave into diamond in case we get discovered by enemy shinobi. The diamond spread from my feet and shaped the cave into a palace, with steps leading to a throne, arches on the ceiling, chandeliers, and 5 different rooms with pedestals for sleeping on, as well as doors. In the middle of the palace there was a large fire pit made of brick diamond. I went to the pit and pulled out a large pile of logs and tossed them into the pit before tossing a fireball at it with my palm lazily. I never did like the way spitting fire made me puff out my cheeks. It was humiliating, so I'd made my own fire jutsu that came from my hands. Basic chakra manipulation. Everything took up about 1% of my chakra. It was too bad I couldn't teach it to Minato, it was quite the useful jutsu. I piled a bunch of logs on the side of the room for the fire, then went to the throne and sat down and relaxed into the arm rest and lifting my feet over the other side. I'd had a giant lawn chair in my past life that I used to laze on just like this in our family's backyard by the pool. My expression soured as I realized I'd forgotten to make a bathing area. I got up with a sigh and focused chakra into my foot for another stomp, then made an entire basement underneath us with a staircase leading to it from the left and the right of my throne. I also needed to write out the cleaning water seals, so I walked down the stairs and wrote them with my own markers since I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of the Uzushio shinobi. Turns out the both of them were a good 5 and 7 years younger than me, making them 15 and 17 respectively. The 17-year-old being the male I'd propositioned into buying me for a night of. I felt my face heat up when I remembered what I'd said after finding out. Jiraiya of all people had to inform me while in front of said Uzushio Nen. "You don't proposition minors for Orochimaru," Jiraiya said with anger and hurt in his eyes. As if I'd cheated on him. "He's barely 17. Oh hush Jiraiya, the boy can make his own decisions. I don't have such qualms about age." I snapped back defensively. Jiraiya had gone silent since then, and resorted to sending small amounts of killing intent to Kishiko. The boy had been thoroughly scared off, much to my chagrin. I didn't mind too much that he'd been a good 5 years my junior, but the words I'd said to Jiraiya had caused the buffoon to scare off my chance of getting laid anytime soon. 8 years practicing abstinence had been a nightmare while surrounded by 3 children. I was far too busy to go out and find another friend of sorts, and I wouldn't have been comfortable sleeping at another house besides my own. There was no way I was going to bring a one-night stand home with the first and second Hokage there to look at me disapprovingly. I sighed once the seals were complete and looked at the giant steaming bath of fresh water. The camp was finally complete. I stood at the edge of the bath to see if I'd forgotten anything before going back upstairs to relax on my throne near the fire. "Alright kids, enough with the dove eyes, we got a mission to debrief," Jiraiya exclaimed loudly, his voice echoing in the palace as he gathered the team around the fire. Tsunade came out of the room she'd claimed wearing a bath robe and stood with her hand on her hip impatiently while the other 2 scrambled to listen to what our team leader had to say. I turned my head and watched them lazily, not caring that Jiraiya was scowling at me with his arms crossed. The fact that he was quite handsome while acting tough was ignored. I wouldn't be able to get past the scent of toad, so that ship had long since sailed. I looked at the boy and narrowed my eyes when he looked away with a bright blush flooding his face. Jiraiya glared at the boy and he paled before standing straight as a rod. "First we should start with explaining everyone's abilities so we can plan appropriately," Jiraiya said in a voice that demanded attention. He was taking his role as team leader quite seriously. "Tsunade?" Tsunade nodded before looking over at me and the other 2. "My main specialization is healing and I'm currently the head of Konoha's hospital. My chakra control allows me to augment my strength beyond what any normal shinobi can accomplish, making me a battlefield medic. I also have some practice with fuinjutsu. I have a summoning contract with Katsuyu, and she specializes in healing and large-scale battles, though I've yet to use her for fighting." "Nagisa," Jiraiya ordered. Nagisa straightened her back, making her larger than average assets bounce as she moved. "Hi Jiraiya-sama," she chimed cheerfully. "I'm an Uzumaki and I got the healing Kekkei Genkei, which is super rare in Uzushio. I focus on the healing branch of fuinjutsu and I can use chakra imprint seals with the seals I've created so far. I'm average in everything else," she said proudly. Jiraiya had been staring at her chest the whole time and probably didn't listen to a word she said before blinking and glaring at Kishiko. "I'm also an Uzumaki," Kishiko started nervously before clearing his throat and talking clearly. "And my main focus is speed, Kenjutsu and Taijutsu. I studied in the barrier branch of fuinjutsu and I'm a..." He glanced at me and blushed before fiddling with his fingers. "I'm an empathetic sensor," he squeaked. I blinked slowly as the implications of that particular gift. Sensing emotions could be extremely useful if I ever managed to get him into bed. I hummed thoughtfully as I looked up at the unlit chandelier. "Well, I'm a ninjutsu specialist foremost, however my skill in taijutsu, kenjutsu, and most everything else is nothing to be scoffed at. My focus with fuinjutsu is in sealing biju, but I've also mastered the basics and intermediate levels of all fuinjutsu according to Mito-sama. Though she may have just been stroking my ego, she's a manipulative minx, that one," I admitted with a roll of my eyes. "I can revive the dead if the body is in perfect condition, however making that possible is not something I excel at. My little minion was good at putting back together dead bodies," I said sourly. I never did have the talent for medical ninjutsu, though I was good enough to recreate organs. Unfortunately, that took up far too much chakra than I could use. Most of my cadavers have been revived and subsequently killed, so I suppose I also specialize in torture methods as long as my minion is present. I get too excited when my victims start screaming and usually overdo it. My minion has been coaching me through it, but I doubt the therapy worked. I should also mention that my medical ninjutsu is slightly above average. High chunin level at best. I frowned as I tried to think about what else I knew. Right, I can also build bases with my diamond jutsu. Nagisa seemed particularly entranced by my skills, however my teammates were both slightly unsettled. Kishiko was brimming with awe as well, which made me preen with pride. So all I'm hearing is you're an evil genius and you corrupt children. Jiraiya began with a grunt. Wait, you didn't get any better in medical ninjutsu? Tsunade said with disbelief while also cutting off Jiraiya. She also looked partly smug. My talents lie elsewhere. I huffed as I lifted my chin. Yeah, his talents lie everywhere else. Nagisa enthused happily. I looked at the preppy girl and felt my ire diminish entirely. I suppose I could grow to like the high-pitched menace. Perhaps I could lure her into my lab to do a few tests on her Kekkei Genkai. It seemed intriguing enough.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.